November 1938. Hotel Carlyle, Madison Avenue, New York City. A woman sits alone in room 412. The curtains are drawn. She hasn't seen a visitor in 3 weeks. Her name is May Goelet, Duchess of Roxburghe, daughter of one of New York's greatest real estate fortunes. 35 years ago, she was worth $20 million, the equivalent of $650 million today. Now she owns nothing. The triple-strand pearl necklace her father commissioned from Tiffany in 1898, $200,000 worth, sold at Christie's in 1931 for $62,000, a fraction of its value. Bought by a Texas oil heiress who didn't know what it had cost May to part with it. The woman at the writing desk, hotel furniture, not hers, is 60 years old. She once had 400 rooms across 3 estates. Now she rents 4 rooms by the month. And she once commanded 40 servants. Now she has 1 maid. She once controlled $20 million in trust, secured by her father on her wedding day, November 20th, 1903, the day she became the Duchess of Roxburghe. That fortune is gone, spent, gambled, squandered. Her husband, Henry John Innes-Ker, the 8th Duke of Roxburghe, took 35 years to destroy what 3 generations of Goelets had built, and May Goelet watched it happen, year after year, estate after estate, until nothing remained but a hotel suite she couldn't afford and pearls she no longer owned. This was not where the story was supposed to end, but this is where obsession with a title, a castle, and a duke who loved gambling more than his duchess always ends. In 1903, May Goelet believed marrying a duke would secure her future forever. Instead, it cost her everything. In 1878, when Mary Goelet was born into the Goelet family's real estate empire, conservatively worth $40 million in the dollars of that era, equivalent to $1.3 billion today, the world believed she would reign forever. She would marry brilliantly, entertain magnificently, and anchor the Goelet name to European aristocracy for generations. Instead, she married a duke who preferred cards to propriety and horses to husbandry, and she watched $20 million dissolve like morning frost on the Hudson River. This is the story of how a woman born with everything, money, beauty, lineage, and the full confidence of Gilded Age New York, lost the most carefully assembled fortune her family had constructed across 3 generations. But more than that, it is the story of what wealth truly means when the laws of marriage and society conspire against the very women it was meant to protect, and what no amount of money can ever buy. Mary Wilson Goelet, born February 18th, 1878, in the family's brownstone at 591 Fifth Avenue, New York City, heir to a real estate fortune so immense it had reshaped the physical landscape of Manhattan. When she entered the world, her family's wealth was estimated at $40 million in period currency, equivalent today to $1.3 billion. To understand the magnitude of what the Goelets had built, the family owned more Manhattan real estate than any private family except the Astors. Their holdings stretched from Midtown to the edges of Washington Square. Their buildings generated rental income that arrived like tides, relentless, vast, and seemingly inexhaustible. She would grow up between 591 Fifth Avenue and Ochre Court, the family's Newport summer palace at Ochre Point. She would be educated by French governesses and finishing school instructors. She would make her debut in 1896 at the age of 18 to reviews in the society columns that bordered on reverence. She would marry once, at 25, into the highest tier of British aristocracy. She would lose her fortune over 35 years, and she would die in 1940 at 62, in circumstances that her grandfather, the man who built the empire, would have found incomprehensible. But the remarkable thing about May Goelet's story is not merely the money itself, it is what the money revealed. About the Gilded Age and its peculiar genius for creating fortunes in one generation and destroying them in the next. And about marriage as a financial instrument that the law made almost entirely controllable by men. About what American heiresses could and could not do with their own wealth. About the exchange rate between old money and old titles that the aristocracy on both sides of the Atlantic had quietly established, and that nobody in polite society discussed directly. This documentary will take you inside the marble halls of Ochre Court, into the drawing rooms of Flore's Castle in the Scottish borders, into the courts where May's trustees fought her trustees, and her trustees fought her husband's solicitors, into the ledger books where a $20 million trust became $5 million, then $2 million, then a set of pressing hotel bills. We will examine every dollar her grandfather accumulated, every property her father added, and every jewel she wore on her wedding day, every pound her husband spent at the card tables of White's Club in London, every penny lost, every lesson that nobody in the end learned, because May Goelet's story is America's story in its most gilded hour, the story of wealth created in one generation, concentrated in another, and scattered in a third, the story of privilege without protection, money without meaning, and a cage so exquisitely constructed of gold that the woman inside never quite understood she was a prisoner. Let us begin where all fortunes begin, with the men who made them. May Goelet's fortune did not appear from nowhere. It was assembled, parcel by parcel, across 3 generations of men who understood one essential truth about New York City, that the land itself would always be worth more tomorrow than it was today, and that the family that held it longest would win. Robert Richard Goelet, born 1807 in New York City, into modest circumstances. His grandfather, Peter Goelet, had been a hardware merchant during the colonial period who had, with considerable foresight, invested his earnings not in inventory or ships, but in Manhattan real estate during the period when such land could still be purchased cheaply. It was a modest start, several lots in Lower Manhattan, an investment that cost perhaps $2,000 total, and that sat dormant while the city grew northward toward it. Peter Goelet died in 1811 before he understood what he had done. His son, Robert Richard Goelet, understood it perfectly. By the 1840s, when New York was expanding with a velocity that shocked European visitors, the Goelet lots had become the Goelet blocks. Sir Robert Richard did not merely hold the land, he developed it. He built commercial buildings, then residential buildings, then hotels. He watched the city's center of gravity shift uptown and shifted his investments ahead of it, like a man walking ahead of a wave. By 1850, the family's real estate portfolio generated annual rental income of approximately $300,000, equivalent to $10 million today, from properties scattered across Lower and Midtown Manhattan. His methods were straightforward and, in the context of their era, entirely accepted. He borrowed against existing properties to purchase new ones. He leveraged political connections to ensure favorable treatment from city commissioners, and he held, rather than sold, to resisting the temptation to liquidate during the periodic downturns that claimed less patient investors. He treated real estate not as a transaction, but as a patrimony, something built for the generations who would follow. His son, Robert Goelet, May's father, was born in 1841 into wealth of a scale that had no precedent in the family's history. Educated at private schools and the Columbia College, he was formed entirely differently from his grandfather. He had never known poverty. He had never needed to be ruthless in the way the original land buyers had been ruthless. What he brought instead was administrative elegance, the capacity to manage a complex portfolio of hundreds of properties across Manhattan, to negotiate leases with commercial tenants, to oversee the architectural development of new buildings, and to expand the family's social standing at a pace that matched the expansion of its financial standing. Robert Goelet married Harriet Warren in 1869. Harriet came from a family of considerable social standing, if more modest financial means, and she brought to the marriage something the Goelets had always slightly lacked: social confidence. She was tall, composed, and had the gift of managing a household at any scale without visible effort. Together, Robert and Harriet Goelet would do what few Gilded Age families managed with equal success: build a fortune while simultaneously building a social position to match it. The household they established was, by any measure, extraordinary. Their primary residence at 591 Fifth Avenue was a 4-story brownstone whose annual maintenance cost exceeded $50,000. And their staff numbered 32 full-time servants, from the butler, a Scotsman named Harrison who earned $900 per year, to the kitchen girls who earned $4 per week. Their social calendar required a formal dinner party, no fewer than twice monthly during the season, each event catering for 40 to 80 guests at a cost of $1,200 per evening. They maintained a private box at the Metropolitan Opera. They kept horses and carriages sufficient for any weather or occasion. And then they built Ochre Court, completed in 1892 at a cost of $4.5 million, $150 million in today's terms. Ochre Court at Ochre Point, Newport, Rhode Island, was the physical expression of everything the Goelets had become. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who would go on to design the Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate, it was built in the French Gothic style, with a tower, leaded glass windows imported from France, a great hall that rose 40 feet to an ornate plasterwork ceiling, and a dining room that seated 100 guests without discomfort. Its grounds covered 12 acres and overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. It cost more to maintain for a single summer season, $75,000, than most Americans earned in a lifetime. By 1878, when May Goelet was born, her family's wealth stood at approximately $40 million in real property and investments. Her father's annual income from rents alone exceeded $2 million. So she was born into a world where wealth was not merely comfort, but environment, where the architecture itself communicated permanence, where the number of servants was a fact as unremarkable as the weather, where the question was never whether there was enough money, but only what, precisely, to do with it. February 18th, 1878, 591 Fifth Avenue. Dr. James Rushmore attended the birth. Harriet Goelet, age 31, delivered her second child and only daughter at 10 in the morning. Robert Goelet received the news in his study with the composure of a man who had already arranged everything. His wife had previously given birth to Robert Walton Goelet, now 4 years old, who stood to inherit the bulk of the family estate and the management responsibilities that came with it. May, the family used this contraction from the start, would inherit differently. Her fortune would be arranged, protected, structured for a woman's life in a way that reflected the Goelets' understanding of what that life would require. Telegrams went out to family and friends across the city and to the family's connections in Boston, Philadelphia, and Newport. The newspapers noted the birth in their society columns the following morning. The gifts that arrived during the first week alone, silver christening sets, jewelry, embroidered linens, carved cradles, were valued in total at approximately $12,000, a sum equivalent to 3 years' wages for the senior staff who carried them up the servants' entrance. The nursery occupied the entire upper floor of the Fifth Avenue house, and its windows looked north toward what would later become the park. The wallpaper, imported from Zuber and Scie in Alsace, a firm that had been producing hand-painted panoramic wallpapers since 1797, depicted a Rhineland landscape in 12 panels. It had cost $4,000 and taken 2 craftsmen from Paris 3 weeks to hang. The crib was rosewood, ordered from a cabinet maker on Madison Avenue at a cost of $800. 2 nurses were assigned full-time to the nursery, each earning $5 per week. May's earliest years unfolded between the Fifth Avenue house in winter and Ochre Court in summer, with occasional seasons at the family's house in Paris, a rented apartment on the Rue de Rivoli that cost $1,200 per month and required a separate staff of 8. Her daily life followed the rhythms of a very specific kind of aristocratic childhood: French lessons at 6 in the morning, piano instruction from a Juilliard-trained teacher who came 3 times weekly at $40 per session, deportment classes on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and drawing lessons on Saturdays from an artist imported from London. She was, by all contemporary accounts, a beautiful child, fair-haired, with her mother's composure and her father's directness. Society columnists who encountered her at family entertainments noted her poise. Her father's business correspondents occasionally mentioned her, always with affection, sometimes with the particular kind of bemused pride that Gilded Age fathers reserved for daughters they had no intention of putting to work. At 13, she was enrolled at the Brearley School on Manhattan's Upper East Side, where the daughters of New York's most prominent families received the particular education that the era prescribed for their futures: literature, French, history, music, deportment, and, in a nod to the practical, basic arithmetic, though not accounting, and not the management of capital, and not the structure of trust, which was considered unsuitable knowledge for a girl who would have trustees to manage such things on her behalf. At 16, she was sent to a finishing school in Lausanne, Switzerland, where she spent 2 years among the daughters of European nobility and American railroad fortunes, learning the final layer of polish that distinguished the merely wealthy from the social elite. Cost $4,000 per year, payable in advance, plus an annual clothing allowance of $6,000 for the wardrobe appropriate to the school's social obligations. Her parents visited twice. Her letters home described lessons in Italian, dancing, embroidery, and the management of formal correspondence. She excelled at languages. She returned to New York in the spring of 1895, age 17, speaking French with a Parisian accent, Italian with a Roman one, and possessing a wardrobe of 36 gowns, 14 afternoon dresses, 7 tea gowns, 2 riding habits, and a sable-lined opera cloak that had cost $1,800 at Worth's in Paris. She was, by every measure the Gilded Age applied, ready. Her debut was arranged for the winter season of 1896. Harriet Goelet organized it with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. The ball was held at Delmonico's Grand Ballroom on Fifth Avenue, the only venue in New York City that combined sufficient grandeur with the logistical capacity to manage 500 guests at a formal dinner dance. The guest list was curated with the precision of a military operation. Every member of Mrs. Astor's 400 received an invitation. The cream of Newport society was present. Visiting Europeans of title, a necessary element of any debutante event aspiring to true significance, had been secured in advance. May Goelet arrived in a gown of white silk satin designed by Charles Frederick Worth's house in Paris, the original Worth, not his successors, at a cost of $3,000. She wore her mother's diamonds, a parure of necklace, earrings, and tiara that had been commissioned from Tiffany in 1880 at a cost of $45,000, and that caught the gaslight of Delmonico's in patterns that made the society columnists search for new adjectives. The New York Times covered the debut in its society pages the following morning, describing Miss Goelet as one of the most distinguished debutantes in recent memory, combining the natural grace of her mother's family with the commanding presence of her father's. The Herald was more direct. She will not want for suitors. They were correct. She did not want for suitors. Understanding what happened to May Goelet's fortune requires understanding precisely how it was constructed. The structure of her wealth was not accidental, and it was the product of deliberate legal architecture designed by her father and his attorneys at Sullivan and Cromwell to accomplish a set of competing objectives: to provide May with financial security, to prevent any husband from gaining outright control of her assets, and to ensure that the Goelet family's real estate empire remained ultimately intact, regardless of what circumstances May's marriage might generate. The trust was created in 1903, coincident with May's engagement to the Duke of Roxburghe. Its terms were as follows. Principal: $20 million in cash and securities, transferred from Robert Goelet's personal holdings into an irrevocable trust on November 1st, 1903. At the then prevailing interest rates of approximately 4% annually, this principal was designed to generate an annual income of $800,000, equivalent to $26 million per year in today's terms. The trustees were 3 men: May's brother, Robert Walton Goelet, the family attorney, James Stokes of Sullivan and Cromwell, and a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company named Edward Biddle, selected for his expertise in managing large inherited estates. These 3 men had the authority to approve or deny any expenditure from principal, any significant investment decision, and any decision to liquidate assets within the trust. May could not remove them without a court order. They were compensated at 1% of annual income, $8,000 each per year, equivalent to $260,000 today. Shown what May received directly, the full annual income of $800,000 paid quarterly. This was hers outright, to spend without trustee approval. It was, by any measure, a staggering sum, but it was income, not principal. The $20 million in capital remained under her trustee's effective oversight. What May could not do without trustee approval: access the principal directly for any purpose, sell or mortgage the trust's underlying securities, transfer any portion of the trust to her husband or to anyone else, change the terms of the trust's inheritance provisions, or make any investment from principal in excess of $50,000. Her brother Robert stood to benefit from whatever remained of the trust at May's death if she died without children who survived her, which created a dynamic that would eventually prove significant. The marriage settlement negotiated between the Goelet family attorneys and the Duke of Roxburghe's solicitors in October 1903 was one of the most extensively documented financial negotiations of the Edwardian era. The Duke's solicitors arrived with a clear understanding of what was on the table. The Goelet attorneys arrived with an equally clear understanding of what was to be protected. What May brought: the trust income of $800,000 annually, personal jewelry valued at $300,000, personal property and clothing valued at approximately $60,000, and the expectation, correctly fulfilled, that her father would make additional gifts during his lifetime. What the Duke brought: the title of Duchess of Roxburghe. She had one of the 12 premier dukedoms of Scotland, Floors Castle in Kelso in the Scottish borders, a property of 55,000 acres whose upkeep cost £200,000 sterling per year, a reputation as one of the most sought-after bachelors in British society, and personal debts totalling, his solicitors quietly acknowledged, approximately £150,000 sterling, roughly $750,000 at the then prevailing exchange rate. The pre-nuptial agreement stipulated that May's trust income remained entirely her own property. Her husband could not attach it, encumber it, or claim any portion of it in the event of separation or divorce. What became practically uncontrollable, however, yet was the question of what she chose to spend that income on, and the cost of maintaining the life that the dukedom required was, from the very first year, almost precisely equal to, and frequently in excess of, what the trust generated. Henry John Innes-Ker, 8th Duke of Roxburghe, born October 24th, 1876, at Floors Castle, Kelso, Roxburghshire, Scotland. He was, at 27, everything the Gilded Age marriage market had decided it wanted in a European aristocrat. Tall, good-looking in a careless outdoor way, educated at Eton and Christ Church, Oxford, where he had distinguished himself at cricket and hunting rather than scholarship, and possessed of a lineage that traced to the 11th century, and a title that commanded respect in every room on 2 continents. He was also, his contemporaries agreed privately, and his biographers have confirmed, a man whose enthusiasms were organised around gambling and horses, in that order, with shooting and cards a close third and fourth. How they met is documented with some precision. May Goelet and the Duke of Roxburghe first encountered one another at a dinner given by the Duchess of Marlborough, the former Consuelo Vanderbilt, herself a product of the transatlantic marriage market, at Blenheim Palace in August 1901, during May's second extended European tour. She was 23, he was 24. The introduction was made by Consuelo herself, who had by then been a duchess for 6 years, and had developed a thorough understanding of what that life required and what it cost and who could afford it. The courtship lasted 2 years and was conducted primarily by correspondence, long letters, carefully preserved, that show a relationship developing at the pace the era prescribed. Formal at first, then warm, occasionally tender, always aware of the social scrutiny under which it proceeded. His letters showed genuine interest in May's opinions and real affection for her wit. Hers showed a woman who was drawn to him and who had thought carefully about what the life he offered would entail. There is no evidence that she was coerced into the match. There is substantial evidence that she understood it would be expensive. The engagement was announced in September 1903. The New York Times published the news on September 12th under the headline, "Miss Goelet to be Duchess," and devoted 6 column inches to the background of both families, the expected terms of the settlement, and a description of May Goelet's position in American society. The piece noted, with the period's characteristic directness on such matters, that Miss Goelet's fortune is expected to be of material assistance in the restoration and maintenance of Floors Castle, which has suffered in recent years from the general depression affecting Scottish estate incomes. The wedding took place on November 20th, 1903, at St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue, the same church that had hosted the marriages of several other prominent American heiresses to European titles. The ceremony was attended by 580 guests. The guest list represented the summit of both American and European society: Vanderbilts, Astors, Belmonts, and Whitneys on the American side, British dukes, earls, and countesses on the other. May wore a gown of ivory satin duchesse, designed by Worth Paris, with a court train of 16 feet, embroidered with the Goelet and Roxburghe family crests in silver thread. The veil was Brussels lace, old family lace given to her by her grandmother, valued at $20,000. She wore for the first time publicly a diamond tiara ordered for the occasion from Cartier Paris at a cost of $65,000, and a diamond and emerald necklace given to her by the Duke, purchased, her trustees noted privately, with money borrowed against the expectation of her income. The bridesmaids numbered 12. The flowers alone cost $4,000. The reception, held at 591 Fifth Avenue following the ceremony, cost $18,000 for food, champagne, an orchestra of 30 musicians, and the flowers that had been rearranged from the church to the house by a team of 8 florists working through the previous night. Total cost of the wedding events across 3 days, $44,000, equivalent to $1.4 million today. Robert Goelet paid for all of it, without complaint or comment. The honeymoon proceeded by private railcar to San Francisco, then by steamship to Japan, then to England, arriving at Floors Castle in February of 1904. The private railcar, leased from the Pullman Company at $400 per day, was staffed by May's personal maid, the Duke's valet, and a cook imported from Delmonico's for the purpose. The steamship booking occupied the entire first-class promenade deck at a cost of $8,000. The total honeymoon cost, approximately $30,000 over 12 weeks. Floors Castle, when May arrived as its new Duchess, was everything its description had suggested and rather more than she had been prepared for. It was a vast, cold, magnificent building on the banks of the River Tweed, 500 rooms in its most generous counting, with a history stretching back to 1721, a staff of 42 indoor servants and 60 outdoor staff, including gamekeepers, gardeners, and grooms, and an annual maintenance cost that arrived each January like a statement of terms from a creditor who never quite became a friend. The indoor staff wages for Floors Castle in 1904, the butler at £150 sterling per year, the housekeeper at £80, 12 footmen at £45 each, and 8 housemaids at £35 each, the head cook at £90, 8 kitchen staff at £25 each, the head gardener at £100, 25 undergardeners at £25 each, 15 gamekeepers at £50 each, 12 grooms at £45 each. Total annual staff wages, approximately £8,000 sterling per year, $40,000 at the contemporary exchange rate. But wages were not the primary cost. The maintenance of a 55,000-acre estate in the Scottish borders, the repairs to the fabric of a building that had been standing for nearly 2 centuries, the upkeep of driveways, gardens and fishing rights, the heating of 500 rooms through Scottish winters, the replacement of linen and silver and furniture as they aged, and the entertainment of the shooting parties that social obligation required, cost, in a good year, £180,000 sterling. In the first year of May's residence, the accounts showed an expenditure of £220,000. At the exchange rate of $5 to the pound, this was $1,100,000. May's trust income that year was $800,000. The deficit in the first year of marriage, $300,000. She addressed it the only way available to her. She wrote to her trustees and requested a partial distribution from principal. James Stokes at Sullivan and Cromwell replied with a letter that combined sympathy with legal clarity. The trust permitted distributions from principal for necessary maintenance of lifestyle, but the trustees required documentation of the expenditure and a plan for addressing the ongoing deficit. Robert Walton Goelet, her brother and co-trustee, wrote separately to express his concern about the pattern being established. She distributed $250,000 from principal in 1904. It was the first of 37 such distributions over the next 2 decades. The marriage had its pleasant years. Contemporaries who knew the Roxburghs in the first decade of their marriage describe a household that functioned, on the surface, with the elegance appropriate to its position. May proved an accomplished chatelaine. Her American practicality and her Brearley School education served her better in the actual administration of a great house than the finishing school ornaments she had been more formally taught. She managed the household accounts with thoroughness. She supervised the renovation of Floors Castle's interior, importing craftsmen from Edinburgh and London at considerable cost to restore and modernize rooms that had not been touched since the 1840s. She entertained magnificently. The Roxburghe shooting parties during the autumn season became fixtures of the Scottish social calendar, attended by members of the royal household and the apex of London society. She also, in 1905 and 1908, gave birth to 2 children, Henry John Innes-Ker, the Marquess of Beaumont, born in May 1905, and a daughter, Rosalie, born in 1908, and who died in infancy in 1909. The births were each covered extensively by both the British and American press. Sir Robert Goelet gave his daughter $100,000 at the birth of each child, gifts that were noted appreciatively in May's correspondence, and applied, in both cases, almost immediately to the outstanding deficit at Coutts and Company, the Roxburghe family bank. The Duke's gambling losses, which began to appear in the household accounts as early as 1906, were documented with the particular euphemism that the era's financial correspondence reserved for such subjects. They appeared under entries titled His Grace's Personal Obligations and Settlement of Outstanding Personal Accounts, never as gambling debts, which would have required acknowledgement of the thing itself. In 1906, these entries totaled £45,000. In 1907, they totaled £62,000. In 1908, they totaled £93,000. So the cumulative total of the Duke's personal obligations settled from joint household accounts between 1904 and 1910 was, by the estimate of the Roxburghe family archivist who examined the records a century later, approximately £600,000 sterling, $3 million. May knew. Her correspondence with her mother from 1907 makes this plain, though in the oblique language that women of her class used to discuss marital difficulties. She wrote to Harriet Goelet in October 1907, "The accounts have again required supplementing in ways I had not anticipated, and I find Henry's management of certain personal matters to be less measured than I could wish." This was, by the standards of Edwardian correspondence between a duchess and her mother, a declaration of considerable distress. What she could do about it was limited by law, by custom, by love, which she appears to have retained in diminishing form until at least 1912, and by the practical reality that a divorce would have cost her the title, the social position, and the custody of her son, whose legal guardianship under British law rested automatically with his father. She was, in the most technically precise sense of the phrase, trapped. By 1912, she had distributed a total of $3 million from her principal trust to cover the accumulated deficits of 8 years of Roxburghe housekeeping. The principal, which had stood at $20 million in 1903, stood at $17 million. The annual income generated by this reduced principal was correspondingly reduced from $800,000 to $680,000, and the annual expenditure required by the dukedom had, meanwhile, grown. The staff had expanded. The shooting parties had grown more elaborate. The duke's personal obligations had not diminished. The second year's deficit was larger than the first, and so the pattern was established that would, with the remorseless logic of compound subtraction, eliminate the fortune entirely in the decades that followed. By 1920, May Goelet's position had altered materially. The First World War had transformed Britain in ways that affected great houses everywhere, not merely Flores Castle. Income taxes that had never existed before the war now consumed 30% of income. The agricultural rents that formed the backbone of the Roxburghe estate's income had declined as farming became less profitable. The value of the 55,000 acres, while nominally large, generated less income than it had before the war. The economic structure that had made a great Scottish dukedom a desirable acquisition in 1903 had been substantially altered. The Duke's gambling had not altered. In 1919, the year the peace was signed and the world attempted to reconstruct itself, Henry John Innes-Ker, 8th Duke of Roxburghe, lost £175,000 at cards and on horse racing, a sum equivalent to approximately $875,000 over the course of a single year. The documentation of this comes from the accounts of White's Club, from the private betting books that several of his contemporaries kept, and from the records of his personal bank account at Coutts, which his wife's solicitors were permitted to examine during the legal discussions that preceded their formal separation in 1921. The separation was not a divorce. English law in 1921 made divorce sufficiently expensive and sufficiently public that both parties agreed, on the advice of their respective legal teams, to a formal deed of separation that divided their financial responsibilities and established May's right to live wherever she chose, with full access to her trust income, while the Duke retained Flores Castle and the management of the Roxburghe estate. The legal fees for negotiating the separation, £12,000 for May's solicitors, and £8,000 for the Duke's, paid by May from her trust income as part of the settlement's terms. The irony was not lost on her. The settlement also required a final accounting of the trust's principal. The figure, when Sullivan and Cromwell and Coutts and company had finished their calculations, was $9,200,000, from $20 million to $9.2 million in 18 years, a loss of $10.8 million, equivalent to $350 million today, at an average rate of $600,000 per year. The first 5 years alone, 1903 through 1908, had cost $3 million. The war years, during which the cost of the estate multiplied while income declined, had cost another $3 million. The final accounting of what the Duke's gambling had directly extracted, through household accounts, through borrowed advances against trust income, through the settlement of personal obligations, was $4.8 million. The Roxburghe marriage had cost May Goelet exactly $10,800,000. She was 43 years old. She had $9.2 million remaining, and she had learned, in the most thorough manner available, precisely what wealth could not protect against. The years between 1921 and 1930 were, paradoxically, among the most socially comfortable of May's adult life. Freed from the administrative and emotional burden of Flores Castle, she established herself in London, taking a long lease on a house in Grosvenor Square at £7,000 per year. She travelled extensively, Paris, Rome, to the south of France, maintaining a style of life appropriate to her station, but considerably less expensive than the dukedom had required. Her annual expenditure during this period averaged $350,000, well within the income her reduced trust generated. She was received everywhere as the Duchess of Roxburghe. The title remained hers for life under the terms of the separation. She entertained at a level that attracted the most prominent figures in European society. She was, to the casual observer, a woman of wealth and position enjoying the freedoms that had been denied her during 18 years of a difficult marriage. What the casual observer could not see was the trust document and its declining principal. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 did not ruin May Goelet's trust directly. Its assets were primarily in government securities and conservative bonds, rather than in the speculative equities that collapsed most spectacularly. But it did three things that mattered enormously over the following decade. It reduced the yield on safe investments from 4% to approximately 2%, cutting her annual income from the trust from $368,000 to $184,000. It reduced the value of the trust's American real estate holdings. A portion of the principal had been invested in Manhattan commercial properties by approximately 40% over 3 years, and it created the economic conditions that led May Goelet to make, in 1932, the worst financial decision of her life. The investment was a South American railway scheme proposed by a promoter named Arthur Levington, who had been introduced to May through mutual acquaintances in Paris in the spring of 1931. The scheme proposed to build and operate a railway line connecting Buenos Aires to Córdoba on the basis of Argentine government concessions that Levington claimed to have secured. He was urbane, well recommended by people May trusted, and persuasive in the manner of men who specialize in being persuasive to wealthy women. May invested $1,200,000 from the trust principal, securing the necessary trustee approvals by presenting documentation that Levington had either fabricated or grossly misrepresented. The railway was never built. The Argentine government concessions, yet when Sullivan and Cromwell attempted to investigate them in 1934, were found to be either non-existent or worthless. Levington had disappeared. The money was gone. She was 54 years old. The trust, after the Levington loss, stood at approximately $4,600,000, generating annual income of $92,000 at the prevailing 2% rate. She was still, technically, a millionaire, but the distance between $4.6 million and her original $20 million was not merely numerical. It represented the elimination of every margin of safety, every buffer against further loss, every reserve that might have protected her from the ordinary accumulation of misfortune that attends any human life of sufficient length. She sold the Grosvenor Square house in 1932 and moved to a smaller establishment in Mayfair, a flat of 6 rooms at £1,500 per year. She reduced her staff from 8 to 3, a personal maid, a cook, and a daily cleaning woman. She cancelled the Paris trips and consolidated to a single summer residence in the south of France, a rented villa rather than the hotel suites she had previously occupied. These were economies. They were not yet ruin, but they were visible to the people who had known her for 30 years, and visibility was, in the world she inhabited, its own kind of loss. The Roxburghe jewellery, which had been a secondary portfolio of remarkable pieces accumulated over the course of the marriage and supplemented by her own purchases, began to go in 1931. First, the triple-strand pearls, to Christie's in London for $62,000, against an insured value of $200,000. Then a pair of diamond and ruby ear clips, sold privately to a Parisian dealer for $40,000, against an original cost of $85,000. Then a sapphire parure that Robert Goelet had given her on her 30th birthday, necklace, bracelet and brooch by Fabergé, sold at auction in Geneva in 1934 for $120,000 against an original value of $250,000. Each sale was covered in the press, and each generated the particular species of public sympathy and private judgment that accompanies a great fortune's visible decline. The society columns noted the sales with a sadness that was partly genuine and partly the satisfaction that attends the confirmation of a familiar narrative. The American heiress, who had bought a title, had discovered at last what titles actually cost. By 1936, the trust, what remained of it, stood at approximately $2 million. The annual income at the prevailing rates was $40,000. This was, by any ordinary measure, a comfortable income. But for a woman whose annual expenditure had been structured around $800,000 for the first decade of her married life and $350,000 for the decade following, $40,000 was poverty by a different name. She moved to New York in 1937. The return was itself a kind of admission, and she took rooms at the Hotel Carlyle, the same hotel where this story began, at $380 per month, which represented a significant portion of her monthly income. She had one maid, whom she paid $18 per week. She ate in the hotel dining room rather than entertaining. She received visitors in the hotel sitting room rather than in a drawing room she owned. Her son, the 9th Duke of Roxburghe, following his father's death in 1932, visited when he could from Scotland. He was, by all accounts, a considerate son, but the Roxburghe estate had its own financial difficulties. The war had done to Scottish estates what the Depression had done to American fortunes, and his capacity to assist his mother financially was limited. The old friends who still called on her at the Carlyle in 1937 and 1938 described a woman who remained, in bearing and conversation, entirely the Duchess she had always been. She dressed carefully in the clothes she had, the pre-Depression Mainbocher suits, the Schiaparelli evening coat that she wore to every formal occasion because it was still magnificent and it was still hers. She wore on her left hand a diamond solitaire that her father had given her before the wedding, a single stone of 4 carats that she had never sold, a fact that her acquaintances noted with the particular appreciation her reserved for the last held possession. She spoke of money very rarely. She spoke of Flore's castle with warmth, and she spoke of the Duke, dead 6 years, with the neutral accuracy of a woman who had resolved her feelings about a complicated subject and preferred not to reopen it. May Goelet, Duchess of Roxburghe, died on November 17, 1940, at the Hotel Carlyle, New York City. She was 62 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure. She was alone except for her maid when she died, at 4 in the morning. The New York Times published an obituary of 4 paragraphs on November 19, 1940. The piece noted her family background, her marriage to the Duke of Roxburghe, and the fact that she was survived by her son, the 9th Duke. It did not mention money. It described her as a distinguished figure in both American and European society for 3 decades. It was not wrong. It was simply not the whole story. And the probate of her estate was filed in the Surrogates Court of New York County in January 1941. Total estate value, $342,000, consisting primarily of the contents of her hotel rooms, her remaining jewelry including the diamond solitaire, her personal clothing, and the residue of the trust, which had by this point been reduced by the monthly draws on principal required to supplement her income during the final 3 years. Outstanding debts, $48,000, including 14 months of unpaid hotel bills, outstanding accounts with 3 dressmakers, and a medical account from the physician who had attended her in her final months. Net estate, $294,000, all of it bequeathed to her son, the 9th Duke of Roxburghe. She had inherited, through the trust established on her wedding day, $20 million. She left, 37 years later, $294,000, a loss of $19,706,000, equivalent in today's money to approximately $640 million. The funeral was held at St. Thomas's Church on November 21, 1940, the same church where she had married 37 years earlier. The attendance numbered 63. The burial was in the Goelet family plot at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, beneath a stone that reads, Mary Wilson Goelet, Duchess of Roxburghe, born February 18, 1878, died November 17, 1940. Nothing about the fortune, nothing about the marriages, nothing about the years at Flore's castle, the shooting parties, the pearls, the Fabergé sapphires, the railway scheme, the hotel bills, the maid who found her at 4 in the morning, just the name and the dates. How does a woman lose $20 million in 37 years? The answer, in May Goelet's case, was arrived at through the intersection of several distinct forces, none of which she could control individually, and none of which, working together, she had any real chance of surviving financially intact. The structural problem began with the trust itself. Robert Goelet's intent was honourable. He wished to provide for his daughter while preventing a husband from simply appropriating her wealth. The trust accomplished this in a narrow, technical sense. The principal was never simply handed over to the Duke of Roxburghe and lost in a single transaction. But what the trust's architects had not accounted for was the annual income mechanism's susceptibility to lifestyle inflation. $800,000 per year, in the context of a Gilded Age dukedom's annual requirement, was not wealth. It was a budget that ran in deficit from year one, and a trust that runs in deficit from year one must inevitably consume its principal. The gender factor was equally decisive. May could earn nothing. The structure of her trust, her social position, and the legal realities of the era meant that her income was fixed and her principal was technically protected but practically accessible. She could not negotiate the terms of the Roxburghe household expenditure without her husband's agreement, and she could not refuse to fund obligations that social convention deemed the Duchess of Roxburghe's responsibility. She could not, after 1903, make a different choice about her living arrangements without sacrificing her child's custody and her social position simultaneously. The predatory element, the Duke's gambling, was, paradoxically, the most obvious and the most difficult to quantify precisely. The $4.8 million extracted through his personal accounts over 18 years was not one large theft. It was hundreds of small ones, each individually defensible within the context of a great household's accounts, each building on the legitimacy of the one before it. By the time the cumulative total became undeniable, it had been normalized into the structure of their shared life. The Levington Railway scheme was, and in its way, the most instructive single event in the whole catastrophe. It demonstrated that the end of a bad marriage does not necessarily mean the end of predatory behavior toward the wealthy woman who survived it. It demonstrated that the protections built into the trust, the trustee structure, the documentation requirements, the approvals process, could be circumvented by a sufficiently persuasive operator with good enough references. And it demonstrated that financial inexperience, accumulated over decades of having other people manage one's money, does not self-correct simply because the need for competence arrives. May Goelet was not foolish. She was not extravagant by the standards of her world. She was not passive in the face of her husband's behavior. Her correspondence shows a woman who argued, negotiated, and attempted to exercise whatever control was available to her. What she was, ultimately, was a product of a system that had been designed to protect women by keeping them ignorant of their own finances, and that protection had made her vulnerable in every direction simultaneously. The mansions where she lived still stand in their various conditions. Ochre Court in Newport, Rhode Island, built at a cost of $4.5 million, and the house in which May Goelet grew up during its most magnificent years, is now owned by Salve Regina University, which purchased it in 1947. It operates as an administrative building and event venue. The Great Hall, with its 40-foot ceiling and Gothic stonework, is available for weddings at $1,200 per hour. The grounds are maintained. The view of the Atlantic remains unchanged. Chanteflaw's Castle, in Kelso, Scotland, the property that consumed so much of May's fortune across 18 years of marriage, remains the seat of the Dukes of Roxburghe. The present, 10th Duke, opens it to the public for tours during the summer season. Admission is £14.50. The state rooms, with their contents of furniture, paintings and porcelain accumulated across 4 centuries, are considered among the finest in Scotland. A room is devoted to the Roxburghe family history. May Goelet appears in a photograph dated approximately 1907, standing in the garden, wearing a white dress and a pearl necklace, the necklace that would be sold at Christie's in 1931. She appears entirely at ease. She appears, in other words, to be exactly what she was trained to appear. The 5th-floor suite at the Hotel Carlyle on Madison Avenue has been renovated twice since 1940. The furniture from May's final years was dispersed with the estate's contents. The room is now available at $740 per night. The Goelet family portrait of May, painted by John Singer Sargent in 1902, the year before her marriage, when she was 24 years old and the full fortune was still intact, hangs in a private collection. It appears occasionally in sale rooms. The last time it was offered at auction, in 2018, it sold for $2.4 million. The portrait is of a woman who does not yet know what is coming. She looks out of the canvas with the direct, composed gaze of a woman who has been told she is worth everything. She is beautifully dressed. She is wearing the diamond tiara that would later go to Christie's. She is, by every external measure, exactly what the Gilded Age wanted its heiresses to be. What the painting cannot show is what the ledgers showed, what the probate filing showed, what the letters to her mother showed. The gap between what she appeared to be and what was actually happening to her fortune. That gap is the true subject of this portrait, if only you know how to look at it. In the years since 1940, the story of Gilded Age heiresses who lost great fortunes to European aristocrats has become familiar enough to function as a cautionary cliché. Consuelo Vanderbilt and the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Mary Leiter and Lord Curzon, Anna Gould and the Duc de Talleyrand. The pattern recurs with enough consistency to suggest not individual miscalculation, but systemic design, a transatlantic transfer of American capital into British and European aristocratic maintenance that functioned as efficiently as any formal economic mechanism, and that left most of its American participants poorer and wiser in that order. What made May Goelet's case distinctive was the particular magnitude and the particular speed of the loss. $20 million, the equivalent of $650 million today, gone in 37 years at an average rate of $530,000 annually. This was not the slow erosion of poorly invested capital across generations. It was active consumption, driven by the cost of a lifestyle that had been built for a fortune twice the size of the one that existed. The lesson, if it can be distilled to one, is this: the structure of wealth matters as much as its amount. May Goelet's $20 million was technically protected in ways that the era's legal architecture could achieve. What it was not protected against was the annual deficit that the income generated and the lifestyle required. And no trust document, however carefully drafted, can protect a fortune against a deficit of $300,000 per year, compounded over 4 decades. The modern parallel is immediate. Trust funds that generate insufficient income relative to the lifestyle they are meant to support consume principal by design, not by accident. Can marriages that are entered without full and independent financial advice that includes a frank assessment of what the other party's lifestyle will cost, remain dangerous precisely because the cost is diffuse and annual rather than immediate and visible. The fortune hunter who takes $100 from your wallet is a thief. The one who costs you $300,000 per year through the ordinary operation of a shared household is, in law and in social perception, simply an expensive spouse. In Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in the Goelet family section, the stone over May's grave is modest by the standards of the family's wealth. Her grandfather's stone is 4 times its size. Her father's is carved with an elaborateness that speaks of a fortune still fully intact. Hers is a simple rectangular marker, appropriately maintained, but unornamented. The stone reads, Mary Wilson Goelet, Duchess of Roxburghe, born February 18th, 1878, died November 17th, 1940. If you walk from her stone to her grandfather's, you walk 30 feet and 3 generations and $19,706,000. You walk from the fortune's apex to its end. You walk, in other words, the whole history of the Gilded Age in a single brief line across a quiet piece of ground. Her grandfather made $20 million in 50 years. She spent it in 37. The mathematics of creation and dissolution. Creation is slow, requires genius, requires luck, requires ruthlessness. Dissolution requires only time and the wrong arrangement of circumstances, and a world that was not built to protect the people it most wished in its gilded way, kept to display. The Duke outlived his divorce settlement by 11 years, dying in 1932. His obituary in the Times of London ran to 12 paragraphs and described him as a distinguished sportsman and a generous host. His gambling debts were not mentioned. His wife's fortune was not mentioned. The $4.8 million were not mentioned. They never are. The woman who was born with everything and died with almost nothing rests under marble that cost $4,000, paid for by her son, the 9th Duke of Roxburghe, from the $294,000 she left him, which was the last of the Goelet money, and which he spent, with appropriate filial gravity, in putting her name in stone. Even at the end, the fortune that remained was used to mark the place where the fortune had been. Even in death, if the arithmetic of the Gilded Age persisted, what was built by one generation, displayed by another, and noted in its passing by a third. The Duchess of Roxburghe, born 1878, died 1940, and in between, the whole bright, expensive, ruinous, instructive story of what American wealth, unprotected and unlucky, could become.